Good evening and welcome again to the Canadian Orthodox Monastery. I rather suspect we'll have a little difficulty with lighting and probably with automatic zooming this evening from this camera. But anyway, I wanted to take up a subject that's come up several times, and a number of you, those of our viewers who are atheists, it comes up in some of the videos that you watch or send around. And don't get seasick, I know it's zooming a little bit. But it also comes up from other Christians, and particularly from Orthodox Christians, who want a more complete explanation, and that is the unfortunate teaching of original sin. And Orthodox people ask mostly, what's the difference between the Western teaching of original sin and the Orthodox idea of the ancestral sin, the pervorodny grek or propatoricum amartio, And I wanted to explain it a little for everybody. The idea that the doctrine of original sin, which was basically invented by, as usual, Augustine of Hippo, the father of all of the corruptions of theology in the West, is really a concept of genetic guilt, that everyone personally inherits the guilt for Adam's sin in the Garden of Eden, and that everyone is born guilty of this sin. And, oh good heavens, it's making me seasick too. I think I better see what I can do about it, if I can. Maybe. And everybody is born with this genetic guilt. And so the idea came about that baptism was for a kind of negative remission of the guilt of Adam's sin that everyone is born with. Now, Augustine also carried this into his neurotic attitude toward sex, and thought that the enjoyment of this sexual intercourse was part of what transmitted this original sin, this guilt for original sin. So everybody's born with this original, this genetic guilt, and because of that, or for some other reason, everyone is predestined, even before their birth, to heaven or to hell, and there's some other ramifications of this teaching that are equally unpleasant. But I wanted to clarify it a little bit, because when we talk about the ancestral sin in the Orthodox Church, what we're talking about is essentially a toxin or a poison in the stream of life. Mankind is not born guilty of anything. When a child dies, we have a funeral for a saint, one who's pure, not for somebody tainted with some kind of primordial guilt. And what actually happens that comes to us from the ancestral sin is that we understand this ancestral sin as a fall into egotism, self-centeredness, and self-love. And that this toxin is at the root of so many, well, really all of mankind's problems and so much of his misery. Now, the difficulty is that a lot of Christians are still practicing this ancestral sin, egotism, self-centeredness, self-love, which is what makes so many of us so hypocritical and narrow-minded and bigoted. But anyway, the difference between the two is that, first of all, from Augustine's perspective, we inherit this guilt, personally, of the sin of Adam, presumably of Eve as well. Somehow the serpent gets off, or we don't inherit anything from him. But anyway, because of that, man is totally depraved and predestined. Mankind, of course, is not totally depraved. Mankind is essentially good. There's an innate morality in all human beings. And we've had a huge amount of research and experimentation that demonstrates that there's a basic moral notion or concept, even in babies, that comes through in circumstances where they're faced with a choice of some kind. And probably they're not reasoning it out and saying, well, let me see, I think this is better than that, or this kind of behavior is better than the other. It's an innate kind of morality. It's an innate goodness. And how could it be otherwise if we're created in the image and likeness of God? That we're, every human being is still the image and likeness of God. So there has to be an innate moral direction within our lives, a kind of orientation toward virtue, orientation toward the good. And simple observation in life will bear that out. In every society or culture, no matter how pagan it might be, we find a certain moral system of some kind that just is natural to mankind, and that can be seen at the earliest ages. And you can find it at every age in children as well, that in spite of course, the kind of misbehavior, 2 3-year-olds are very egotistical and very self-centered, trying to search their way through the formation of life. But even there, you'll find a certain kind of morality, a certain sense of what's moral and not moral. Mankind is absolutely not totally depraved, nor do we inherit any kind of guilt from anyone, period. We may suffer from the sins of the parents unto 7 generations, as we're told by one of the prophets. And it's easy to see how that takes place, of course. Our parents create a certain situation or a set of circumstances. Very often an abusive father will produce sons who imitate him and are abusive. And a daughter of an abusive father will very often marry an abusive man. So these sins of the fathers do visit us for several generations before we escape them or get over them. A cruel and brutal father will often, this is what he ingrains in his sons, that this is the way to behave, this is the way to raise your family. These things can pass on from one generation to the next until they're somehow weeded out. But there's no inheritance of guilt. The ancestral sin tells us that we have to beware of egotism, self-centeredness, and self-love, that this is the problem. Even sin isn't actually the problem. The problem is the misuse of our energies. And repentance really means to rethink or change the direction we're going. In other words, to use our energies in an appropriate manner rather than to misuse our energies. And this is really what the struggle of repentance is all about. It's not flopping around on the floor, flogging yourself for, I violated this law, I violated that law, I violated the other law. All of this juridicalism is a product of medieval Western scholasticism. So we need to put completely out of our vocabulary any reference to original sin. It's a completely false teaching anyway. And in fact, it comes to us from Gnosticism, not from Christianity. It was originally a Gnostic doctrine, just as predestination was originally a Gnostic doctrine, not a Christian teaching. And consequently, the difference between the two is quite simple. Original sin is genetic guilt. Everybody is born with guilt. You have to burden everybody with this horrendous guilt complex. The ancestral sin is the toxin of self-centeredness, self-love, and egotism. And that's reflected not only in the way wars begin and the way persecutions begin, but often reflected in Christian attitudes toward other people. And we need to come to grips with that and realize that that is the ancestral sin, that we're practicing it. We didn't inherit, we're practicing it. And we need to get over it. So I think I'm running out of time. We'll probably take up this subject again, and I'll respond to the questions that are asked.